And though we've been watching some videos each week from the Bible Project, today we had a little lengthier excerpt because this is a lot of material that we're covering all in one day. Today we are continuing the story of God with a look at the book of Kings. We have just watched the first half of the Bible Project video on Kings. You can watch the rest of that video using the link that's on the bottom of your sermon outline notes. But Kings is a very interesting book. It's filled with all kinds of intrigue, crazy plot twists as we follow many different rulers of Israel and Judah, the bulk of which are caught up in rather questionable situations. Can you imagine living in a nation where the king or president is ruling under the shadow of questionable decisions? I wonder what that would be like. In case you've been living under a rock for the last few months with no access to television or the internet or print media, let me be the first to tell you that our president has been impeached, or is being impeached, or might be impeached, or is acquitted, or maybe acquitted. I'm really not sure I'm still confused from Bill Clinton. I never figured that out. Was he impeached? I'm not sure. I have to be honest with you, most of the time, when an impeachment story comes across my news feed, I scroll on by. I have no interest in these sometimes mind-boggling political games that go on in our culture. Mind you, I want our presidents to rule in ethical ways, right? We want our leaders, we pray that our leaders will govern ethically. However, it doesn't take even an astute observer of history to see that this doesn't always happen. I've read the book of Kings, and just as we saw on this video right now, 0 for 20 were the kings in Israel. They were all bad. And I mean really, really, really bad. And even in the southern kingdom, that is Judah, where Jerusalem is, where God rules from, only 8 of the 20 kings there turn out halfway decent. So let's just say I'm not holding my breath when it comes to my hopes that our politicians will rule in an ethical manner. Part of the issue is the different way people define success. The biblical definition for success for a leader includes moral and ethical choices. Success for politicians today seems to have very little to do with ethics, very little to do with God, even though few are very shy when it comes to divine name dropping. Have you noticed that? Everyone loves God when it comes to the polls. How do politicians define success? It would seem many define success in terms of pride, pleasure, self-promotion. When we open the book of Kings, we find that things weren't a whole lot different 3,000 years ago. From David to Solomon to the rulers of the divided kingdom, Israel in the north, Judah in the south, it got ugly. Listen, if you would, to one commentator's thoughts on the main characters that we find in Kings. Several important characters dictate the plot. David links 1st and 2nd Kings with 1st and 2nd Samuel, which we read last week. Solomon helps fulfill God's promises to David in 2 Samuel 7, verses 1 to 17, yet he also sins in a way that hastens Israel's ruin. Rehoboam and Jeroboam tear the kingdom into 2 pieces, and you just got to love it. It's David, then Solomon, and then the kingdom is split in 2. It doesn't take very long for this to happen. And Jeroboam creates a new religion. Ahab and Jezebel, by the way, if you want some great reading, read Kings. I mean, it's just all kinds of interesting stuff. Ahab and Jezebel lead the nation away from God. Hezekiah, Josiah, and 6 other faithful kings attempt to make the nation repent and seek Yahweh, but ultimately fail to do so. Perhaps the prophets are the book's most impressive characters, because it's the prophets in Kings that tell us that in spite of Israel's persistence in turning away from Yahweh, a reality we have found throughout our book-by-book journey in the Hebrew Old Testament, God refuses to give up on his people. In Kings, this is especially evident in the two biggies, Elijah and, wait one second, before I name the second well-known prophet, I'm going to put our new associate pastor on the spot for just a second. Keith, don't worry about this. It's no big deal. How do you pronounce the second prophet? Elijah and? Elisha. Thank goodness. I'm so happy. I love that. Now, for those of you who haven't been here for very long, Joshua Williamson, our beloved intern who now pastors in Hawaii, suffering for God in Hawaii, he killed me every time he referred to the second prophet as Elisha. There's no Elisha in the Bible, Joshua. I tried to tell him. Actually, he taught a Sunday school class on Elijah and Elisha. And it was a great class because these characters, and you can read their section right there in Kings, it's just interesting material there. So you passed, Keith, you passed. And someone has to tell Joshua, please pronounce that name correctly. But the point is, God was always seeking to woo his people. He never gave up on his people. He sent the prophets for the very purpose of drawing them back to himself. And the message of Kings, a message which resonates throughout the story of God, is that success is defined in relationship with God. Think about that for a second. Do you think that's true? Not just talking about the kings, talking about with us in our lives. Success is defined in relationship with God. Is that true? Listen to what one commentator says. One factor dominates the book's opinions of all kings, nations, and events. If the kings do not worship idols, they are good kings. If they offer sacrifices only in Jerusalem, they are even better. If they destroy idols and bring spiritual renewal, they receive the author's complete approval. Failure in any of these areas leads to national catastrophe. In other words, no factor, economic, military, or otherwise, affects Israel's destiny as much as their relationship to God. This worldview causes the author to write a sacred history that warns future generations of Israelites against repeating the same mistake. And may I be so bold to say that it warns believers today about making the same mistakes, because even though none of us may feel the draw to bow down to an idol or a calf made of gold, all of us struggle with idolatry. There isn't a person in here that doesn't struggle with idolatry. It may not be an image crafted by men, or then again, it may be an image crafted by men that dominates our lives and sucks every moment from us. And you could add all kinds of things to the list. Couldn't you? Things that take away our attention, that rob us of peace. Nothing has changed in 3,000 years. No matter how grand our accomplishments, how great our deeds, if our relationship with God is not right, we have failed. I don't care how nice the car is that you drive, the house that you live in, the job that you have. If your relationship with Jesus is not the center of your existence, I submit to you that it's failing, that something is askew, to put it mildly. This factor, more than any other, is how Kings defines success. Surprisingly, we not only see this message in the lives of Jewish kings, we also see it in the amazing story about a pagan ruler in 2 Kings chapter 5. I invite you to turn to 2 Kings 5 as you take out your sermon outlines from your bulletins. If you didn't receive one of these, just raise your hand, and Klaus will make sure that you get one. So in such a huge book, or two books put together, the question is, how are we going to cover all of this content? Well, what we're going to do is focus in on one specific story that we find in Kings. So we're going to zero in on a short story that we find within these books, which really highlights key themes that we find throughout these books of Kings. Follow along, if you would, as we begin this morning in 2 Kings chapter 5 and verse 1. Now, Naaman was commander of the army of the king of Aram. He was a great man in the sight of his master and highly regarded because through him Yahweh had given victory to Aram. He was a valiant soldier, but he had leprosy. Now, there are two things that are shocking in what I just read. Does anyone know what they are? What's one of them? Anyone? Say again. He is not Hebrew. He is a pagan king, not a king, a pagan military leader. And yet, what does it say there? Who gave him success? Yahweh. This should be shocking, by the way. Now, if you were a Jew, you might see this more readily. But the fact that Yahweh is blessing a pagan king, and what it points out to us is that God is at work around the world in places we may not imagine. We tend to think very self-centeredly, like it's all about me or what God's doing in my place and my life or among my people. And what is revealed here is that even though Israel is the chosen race, the chosen people, God's working elsewhere. And by the way, we see a handful of places throughout the Old Testament where this is proven. Yahweh is at work. He is working even through people who are parts of, leaders of pagan nations. And the second thing that's very extraordinary here is that this man who God is granting success has leprosy. That's not a great sign of success. We'll get to that a little more later. What I want us to zero in on, however, are the words that are used to describe Naaman. He's a commander, a great man, highly regarded, valiant. What guy wouldn't like to be described with these words? Any person would like to be described as highly regarded. Actually, the Hebrew here literally says, of lifted up face. Now, when you think of someone who is confident and strong, do you usually think of them as coming up to you and shaking your hand and saying, "Hi, my name's Dan"? Or do you think of them as having their faces lifted up and confidently addressing you? The latter, right? And this is the picture of the Hebrew word of lifted up face. They're not downcast. They're confident. They're strong. And so here is this leader, Naaman, who's holding his head up high. And I would argue that most of us attain to something like this. But I wonder how much of what we do is driven by, or at least influenced by, our desire to be highly regarded. I mean, think about how significant that is. I mean, again, you think about social media. How much of social media, what percentage of social media posts are driven by a desire to be highly regarded by others? Isn't that true? We all want to be highly regarded. Now, by the way, this isn't a bad thing. Proverbs 3:4 says, winning favor and a good name in the sight of God and man is a great goal. We want to win favor before God and man. Surely it is healthy to desire to be thought well of by others, whether it's the homemaker who seeks to exhibit an orderly, well-kept home, or the employee who strives to do work that is exemplary, or the person whose hygiene and dress communicate healthy grooming and personal care, or the homeowner whose yard and house point to disciplined maintenance, or the Christian who seeks to lead a life that is above reproach. These are all good things. However, idolatry often involves taking a good thing and making it bad by allowing it to devalue greater goods. For example, the homemaker who gives much time, money, and energy to a home but neglects serving others. Or the employee who is more devoted to work than to making disciples of his or her children or his or her spouse and others God puts in their sphere of influence. Or the person who is very focused on image and external beauty while giving only a minimal amount of time to growing in Christ through daily time in His presence. Or the homeowner who shows great care when it comes to his things but doesn't show nearly as much care when it comes to the way he or she speaks to people. Or the Christian who speaks with tongues of men and of angels and has faith that can move mountains but has not love. What does Paul say of that person in 1 Corinthians 13? They're nothing. All that to say that though it is great to be accomplished, successful, to get things done, as we see in Naaman, there are things that are more important. How do we know if we have allowed our pursuit of success to marginalize more important things? Well, few things in our lives reveal that what we are made of as powerfully as trials. I mean, I hate to say it, it's just what it is. Trials reveal our mettle. They reveal what we're made of. And let's just say that Naaman stumbled onto a doozy of a trial, summed up by the last 4 words at the end of verse 1. But he had leprosy. Leprosy is an ugly, ugly reality. And if that is the case today, where we have such great medical care, how much more so thousands of years ago when medical care was so primitive? We pick up the story in verse 2. Now, bands from Aram had gone out and had taken captive a young girl from Israel, and she served Naaman's wife. She said to her mistress, "If only my master would see the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy." So who is the prophet of which he speaks? It's Elisha. But what is truly intriguing here is that Naaman, this great, powerful man, is taking advice from a slave girl. In fact, not only is she a slave, not only is she a girl, but she's young. We begin to see a couple principles at work here that are contrary to the way our world thinks of success. And by the way, we see this throughout the Scriptures. The fact that God loves to use those in humble positions to shame the proud, or as your first outline has it, God humbles the proud. Of course, anyone is susceptible to leprosy, but there's a special significance in a man who has it all, contracting a disease that is at once humbling and something he is powerless to fight. Honestly, I think this is one of the reasons we deem Kobe Bryant's death in a helicopter crash so much more tragic. Here's a man who had it all, who had so much to lose. And someone posted online and said, well, there was a helicopter crash where we lost 30 members of our military. Why didn't this get the airtime? Well, it's because, honestly, we don't know these people. But most people can identify Kobe Bryant. They know who he is. And I think it's true. Anywhere in our nation, you look at this reality, we can relate a little better to him because we kind of know him in some way. And it's true also, Naaman's story becomes all the more tragic because he's a significant man. He's a ruler of men. He's known by many. And so that's why it receives such significant attention here. Even so, it is a good reminder that no matter what greatness we may achieve on earth, we are ultimately subject to the reality of our mortality. No one can escape it. Whether you have a lot of money or little money, a lot of fame or little fame, we are all subject to the reality of mortality. This was undoubtedly a tough lesson for this great man, Naaman, to wrap his mind around. He was the man who had it all. It's not so unusual, however, for us to see God humbling such individuals, which brings us to a second principle, operative here, and that is God exalts the humble. This girl would have been a nobody in that culture. What could she have to offer? It would seem the very thing that her master needed most. We continue in verses 4 through 6. Naaman went to his master and told him what the girl from Israel had said. "By all means go," the king of Aram replied. "I will send a letter to the king of Israel." So Naaman left, taking with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 sets of clothing. The letter that he took to the king of Israel read, "With this letter I am sending my servant Naaman to you, so that you may cure him of leprosy." Now, there are some weights that are listed in this passage that may not mean a whole lot to us. 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold. However, converted to pounds, we are talking about close to 1,000 pounds of gold and silver. We're talking about millions and millions of dollars worth of goods. This isn't chump change. This is a significant donation to Israel. In addition to this, he sends 10 sets of clothing, and given the other gifts, I'm guessing these are along the lines of Armani. These are nice pieces of clothing. Armed with all of his gifts and a letter from the king himself, Naaman makes his way to Israel. We continue in verse 7. As soon as the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his robes and said, "Am I God? Can I kill and bring back to life? Why does this fellow send someone to me to be cured of his leprosy? See how he is trying to pick a quarrel with me." You see what's happening with the king of Israel. It's like, oh, this ruler of a mighty nation is saying that I could heal this guy? Not possible. He's just going to say, well, you failed, and then annihilate me, annihilate us. First of all, you notice that we aren't told who the king is, but we do get a whiff of his character here in verse 7. Truth is, he likely has a reason to be shaking in his boots. Under David and Solomon, Israel had become king of the hill, so to speak. In fact, during the book of Kings, there's a point in Solomon's reign where Israel reaches its greatest landmass. It is top dog. And very quickly, we see the demise of Israel, the split of the kingdom in two, and everything begins to fall apart. And all of a sudden, Israel is the little kid on the block that everyone likes to bully. And so we begin to see this attitude with this king's response, this Israelite king. The funny thing is, Naaman totally misses the instruction the slave girl gave him. Remember, she didn't say go to the king. She mentioned a prophet. But the letter sent to the king of Israel acts as though the king is the source of the healing. It is almost as if Naaman expects that to get what he wants, he must go to the chief, the head honcho, the number one man. It's kind of like the disgruntled customer who says, "Let me talk to the manager." Naaman isn't messing around here. He goes straight to the top. The problem is the guy who's at the top in terms of human success and achievement can't help him. We continue in verse 8. When Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his robes, he sent him this message: "Why have you torn your robes? Have the man come to me, and he will know that there is a prophet in Israel." The king was so distraught that the word had gotten around. But don't you love Elisha's attitude? Send him over here. It's time he learned a lesson. There's a prophet in Israel. The implication, of course, is that there's a true prophet, and if there's a true prophet, then there's a true God. Verses 9 and 10. So Naaman went with his horses and chariots and stopped at the door of Elisha's house. Elisha sent a messenger to say to him, "Go wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan, and your flesh will be restored, and you will be cleansed." Picture this for a moment. Here's Naaman with what is undoubtedly a great caravan, his posse, his entourage, not only carrying him and his men, but carrying all the gifts he had brought. And where does he park? In front of a grand castle? No, in front of what was probably a pretty humble abode. And with all his pomp and circumstance, with gifts beyond imagining and a letter from the king, Naaman knocks on Elisha's door. But guess what? Elisha doesn't even come out. Do you see what it says? Elisha sends his messenger. Doesn't Elisha realize who's at his door? But instead of humbly receiving this powerful man, Elisha sends a messenger. What Elisha communicates in this simple act is another significant principle we find here. That is, God is no respecter of persons. God doesn't care that Naaman is powerful. Isn't it funny in our culture how much credence we give to significant people in our culture? Deb and I were just recounting a story last night that we had gone downtown Seattle with our kids, Jacob and Ellie, to take them to a concert at some theater. What was it? Yeah, whatever it is. theater downtown. And we dropped him off, so we're sitting here near this theater right close to I-5, right across from Barnes & Noble that's going away, so you kind of see the theater I'm looking at. Anyway, we're sitting here in Seattle, and the sidewalk's pretty vacant, not many people, and all of a sudden walks by Bill Gates and his son, who he's taken to the concert that our kids are attending. And we just kind of look and we go, wow, Bill Gates, okay. No security, no nothing. Now, I don't know Bill Gates. I don't have any significant connection with Bill Gates, except that I enjoy using his products a lot, I guess, sometimes. But who's Bill Gates? Why does Bill Gates matter? Who cares? But it's Bill Gates. Why? Because, we honor and we naturally look to people who are significant, people who have a lot of money, people who have a lot of power, who have a lot of influence. I mean, that's just the way we are structured. But here in this passage, God demonstrates the very opposite through Elisha, who doesn't go out to meet him and say, oh, wow, I've heard about you. You are a really awesome, valiant man and everything. No, Elisha says, servant, go talk to him. And so what we see here, again, is that God is no respecter of persons. So what does Elisha say? Naaman, would you please take a bath? I mean, that's his message to Naaman. In verse 11, we see Naaman's response. Do you see that there? But Naaman went away angry and said, I thought that he would surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of Yahweh his God, wave his hand over the spot and cure me of my leprosy. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than any of the waters of Israel? Couldn't I wash in them and be cleansed? So he turned and went off in a rage. Naaman throws a temper tantrum. But try to see it from his perspective. He brings $5 million worth of goods. He has the king write him a letter. He presents himself first before the king of Israel, then before the prophet Elisha. What does Elisha say? Go take a bath? Really? Naaman expects something that is dignified, if not magical. Elisha, come out to meet me. Stand, call on Yahweh God, wave your hand. And wouldn't it hurt if you were wearing a black cape and said, abracadabra, maybe? Instead, you want me to go wash in your dirty old river? I could have done that at home. I appreciate Pastor Timothy Keller's commentary on Naaman's response in his book, Counterfeit Gods. Keller writes, Naaman's entire worldview was being challenged. He had just learned that this God is not an extension of culture, but a transformer of culture, not a controllable, but a sovereign Lord. Now he was being confronted with a God who, in his dealings with human beings, only operates on the basis of grace. These two go together. No one can control the true God because no one can earn, merit, or achieve their own blessing and salvation. Naaman was angry because he thought he was going to be asked to do a mighty thing, as it were, to bring back the broomstick of the wicked witch of the west, or to return the ring of power to Mount Doom. Those would have been requests in keeping with his self-image and worldview. But Naaman's worldview revolves around success, his pride, his power, his self-promotion. Because he's successful, powerful, wealthy, he expects that he can pay off this prophet. He isn't looking for a gift. He wants to purchase his healing, and he's willing to pay dearly. In addition to his bribes, he expects that he will have to do some great heroic deed, again, to earn his healing. But God doesn't operate that way. Neither God nor his prophet are interested in Naaman's gifts, success, or fame. Why? Because God operates solely by grace. This may be the toughest lesson of all for Naaman to learn. You can't bribe Yahweh or do something even to earn his favor. God operates entirely by grace, unmerited favor. That's what grace is. Giving that is sourced not in our success, but in his goodness and sovereign will. We continue in verses 13 and 14. Naaman's servants went to him and said, My father, if the prophet had told you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? How much more then, when he tells you, wash and be cleansed, So he went down and dipped himself in the Jordan 7 times, as the man of God had told him, and his flesh was restored and became clean like that of a young boy. Do you notice again that it's the humble servant who is directing Naaman? You cannot help but see the reaffirmation of the message here that God humbles the proud but exalts the humble. Finally, Naaman humbles himself and does what Elisha ordered, and guess what? He's healed. In fact, the text says his skin was like that of a young boy. It's interesting to note that the Hebrew words young boy are the same words used to describe the Israelite slave girl who directed Naaman to Elisha in the first place, just in the masculine. The Hebrew for young girl is Nara Katana, and the Hebrew for young boy, describing how Naaman's skin became, is Nar Katan. It may be the author's way of further emphasizing the need for us to humble ourselves and become like little children in the way that we approach God. In verse 15, we see how this humbling and healing impacted Naaman. Verse 15, then Naaman and all his attendants went back to the man of God. He stood before him and said, now I know that there is no God in all the world except in Israel. Please accept now a gift from your servant. Don't you just love this profession that he makes? This confession of faith in God? I mean, it's not even one that people in our culture today would be ready to apprehend, right? Now I know that there's no God except Yahweh God. He is God. Naaman went from seeing Yahweh God as a local deity for the Israelites, one of many local deities like the ones he worshipped in Aram, to being the sovereign God of all, which is the final message we see there in our passage. God is sovereign. Talk about sovereign. Israel is a mess. They've gone so far off course from God's plan for them, yet in spite of that, God is still sovereignly accomplishing his purposes. Do you remember the promise that God made to Abraham in Genesis 12? Do you remember that? The Abrahamic covenant. He promises to bless them, right? But then he goes on to promise that he will bless all nations, all peoples through them. The story of Nathan is a dramatic proof of what God said he would do with Abraham in Genesis 12. God's doing it. Even though God's people are not obeying him and not doing what they're supposed to be doing, they're supposed to be a light to the nations. But God uses this humble young servant girl to do that which he wanted to accomplish, and that is draw even the nations to himself, to bless them through his people. God is still accomplishing what he said he would. In fact, even the way the book concludes, this book of Kings, points us to both of these realities. If you would, turn to the end of 2 Kings and take a look at this. But let's watch the last minute or so of the Bible project on the video on Kings. We're skipping to one of the last and worst kings of all, and his name is Manasseh. Check this out.
Right in between these two, Manasseh, he's the worst by far. So he not only introduces the worship of idol statues into the Jerusalem temple, he also institutes child sacrifice. And so God sends prophets to say, the time is up. Israel has reached the point of no return. The final chapters tell the story of the Babylonian Empire coming to invade Jerusalem, destroy the temple, and carry the people and the royal line of David off into exile. And so the story ends leaving us wondering, is God done with Israel? Is he done with the line of David? Well, the final paragraph zooms about 40 years forward into the exile, and it tells a very odd story. It's about Jehoiakim, a descendant from David, who would have been king if he was back in Jerusalem. And the king of Babylon releases him from prison and invites him to eat at the royal table for the rest of his life, and the book ends. So it's not much, but it's a story that gives a glimmer of hope that God has not abandoned the line of David. So the question now is, how is God going to fulfill his promises to Abraham, to David? How is he going to bless the nations and bring the Messianic kingdom? And to answer those questions, you have to read on into the wisdom and the prophetic books. But for now, that's the book of Kings.
Have you noticed that the endings of these books are often not what you'd expect? Have you seen this so far? For example, 2 weeks ago, Judges ended with In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as he saw fit. That's kind of a strange way to end a book. That's not exactly, and they lived happily ever after. The end of a book is supposed to resolve everything, but Judges' conclusion leaves everything unresolved, but in a way that points us to the rise of the monarchy in Israel that we see in Samuel and Kings. In other words, the conclusion points us to the fact that Judges is not meant to be read in isolation. It's meant to be read as part of a bigger story. King's conclusion is just as strange. It's this weird little story about Jehoiakim, or as he said, Jehoiakim, the Davidic heir who is in captivity. This isn't the only time that we see God's preservation of a Davidic heir. In fact, in Kings, there's this story about Athaliah, the only female king to rule, who says, you know what? I'm going to get rid of all the Davidic heirs. I don't want any of them to rise up against me, so I'm going to kill them all. Kill all the kids. Get rid of them. But guess what? God, of course, has another plan. He saves the Davidic heir. As one commentator writes, upon Ahaziah's death, Athaliah declared herself ruler and sought to execute the remainder of the royal family. The high priest protected one royal prince, Joash, by hiding him. Despite the attempt to destroy the line of the Messiah, God protects it in the person of young Joash, who becomes king after Athaliah's execution, the collapse of the northern kingdom, and then of the southern kingdom, as described in detail at the end of Kings, raises the specter of no continuation of the line. Due to the people's sins, not even the righteousness of kings such as Hezekiah and Josiah can save the kingdom. And again, we see Manasseh here at the conclusion of Kings. Manasseh is doing the ugly things that the nations around them did. Child sacrifice. You think, how have God's people gotten to this ugly and disgusting point? So the question is, who can save them? But not even these godly kings are able to do anything about the sin of the people of God. Yet, as with Solomon, Rehoboam, and Joash, there remains an heir to the line of David. The book concludes with Jehoiakim alive and well in exile in Babylon. Thus, both hope and God's anointed remain and can be found throughout the book of Kings. The promise of Messiah is not lost. And so we step back for a second, and once again, we take a look at the bigger story that God is telling through these books. And it's a story of redemption. We sang all about it this morning. We celebrate it in just a few moments in the Lord's Supper. But the reality is God does not give up on his people. So we conclude 2 Kings chapter 25, verses 27 through 30. And this is what we read. In the 37th year of the exile of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, in the year of evil Merodach, in that year, evil Merodach became king of Babylon. He released Jehoiakim from prison on the 27th day of the 12th month. He spoke kindly to him and gave him a seat of honor higher than those of the other kings who were with him in Babylon. So Jehoiakim put aside his prison clothes and for the rest of his life ate regularly at the king's table. Day by day, the king gave Jehoiakim a regular allowance as long as he lived. Again, reading Samuel and Kings in isolation might make this ending seem strange. But when you read it as part of God's bigger story, his ongoing story of redemption, it makes perfect sense. God is preserving and caring for the Davidic line, the line of David. Remember, to whom he made the promise in 2 Samuel 7 when David said, God, I'm going to build you a house. God says to David, I'm going to build you a house. But it's not going to be a physical house. I'm going to preserve a line, descendants, a rule that will go on forever. Of course, this prophecy ultimately looks forward to one who is both in the line of David and who is God's anointed one, his Messiah. We know his name is Jesus. It is Jesus, Messiah, who will sit upon David's throne in fulfillment of God's promises and who will bring salvation to God's people. Yet this salvation will not come by a means of a sword, as we might expect, but through the servant of the Lord, a figure, by the way, which plays prominently in next week's book in the story of God, the book of Isaiah. It's going to be rich. Pray that I know how to preach the entire 66 chapters of the book of Isaiah in one Sunday. But the way God uses humble servants for his saving purposes in the life of Naaman provides a powerful picture of his coming salvation. And I just, again, love the words of Timothy Keller in this regard. The biblical story of salvation assaults our worship of success at every point. Naaman, to be cured, had to accept a word through a servant girl, and later through a servant of Elisha, and finally other servants of his own. In those days, such people were treated as no more important than a pet or a beast of burden by the high and mighty. Yet God sent his message of salvation through them. The answer came not from the palace, but from the slave quarters. The ultimate example of this theme, of course, is Jesus Christ himself. He came not to Rome or Alexandria or to China. He came to a backwater colony. He was born not in the palace, but in a manger, in a stable. Seek not in courts nor palaces, nor royal curtains draw, but search the stables, see your God extended on the straw. All during his ministry, the disciples continually asked Jesus, when are you going to take power? When are you going to stop fraternizing with simple people? When are you going to start networking and raising money? When will you run for office? When's the first primary? When's our first TV special? Instead, Jesus served humbly and then was tortured and killed. Even when Jesus rose from the dead, he first appeared to women, the people who had then no status. Jesus' salvation is received not through strength, but through the admission of weakness and need. And Jesus' salvation was achieved not through strength, but through surrender, service, sacrifice, and death. This is one of the great messages of the Bible. God chooses the weak things of the world to shame the strong, the foolish and despised to shame the wise, even the things that are not, to bring to nothing the things that are. That's how God does it. Or as we read in Mark 10:45, for even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. And so as you contemplate these words, it is our privilege today to celebrate the Lord's Supper together on this first Sunday of the month. I want to invite the men to come forward and prepare the Lord's table. And we usually do it before the sermon, but today I made the determination that it was really just a better fit to do it at the conclusion of our service. Because truly, what the book of Kings looks to is the future king who would bring redemption, who would bring salvation to God's people, Israel. And so this morning, it's our privilege to celebrate that king, that Messiah who was promised, who fulfilled the promises of God, and who is the source of our salvation even today. Because, brothers and sisters, we had something worse than leprosy. We were dominated and controlled by sin. But Jesus has washed us. He has filled us with his own Holy Spirit, given us forgiveness of sin, and filled us with his holiness that we might serve the living God. And so today we celebrate that reality, what Jesus accomplished as we pass the bread and the juice. Just a few words of instruction. Some of you, this is your first time to Renton Bible Church, or you're newer to our church. I want you to know we celebrate an open communion here. So if you know Christ as your Savior, you are welcome to participate in the celebration with us. In just a moment, we'll pass both the bread and the juice. We invite you to take this time to remember what Jesus had done, to take those elements, to hold on to them, and then when you are ready, you may partake of them. And for the last time that I'll ever give this word of instruction, because the next time we have communion, we're going to have little holders on the front of our seats there for your communion cups. But this time, would you set them on the floor, and then if you can, take them with you when you depart the sanctuary today. We're going to pass both of these elements, and we invite you just to use this time for worship, to reflect on what Jesus has accomplished. Before we do that, Ernest, would you pray and give thanks?
Dear God, Here is love,
Vast as the ocean, loving kindness as the flood. When the Prince of Life, our ransom, shed for us his precious blood, who his love will not remember, who can cease to sing his praise. He will never be forgotten throughout heaven's eternal days. On the mount of crucifixion, fountains open deep and wide. Through the floodgates of God's mercy flowed a vast and gracious tide. Grace and love like mighty rivers poured incessant from above. Heaven's peace and perfect justice kissed the guilty world in love. Grace and love like mighty rivers poured incessant from above. Heaven's peace and perfect justice kissed the guilty world in love. Come kiss this guilty world